Thank you for the invitation to the Space Bridge, and also thanks for the kind introductions. Kind of continuing from Helen's presentation, I would maybe like to add that the one focus that we would that we have in our joint publication is to try to understand what are the factors that impede or that could kind of hinder green space uses by all groups to full potential, which addresses in a way also questions, or in a way directly questions of environmental justice. And the case studies that we have drawn together are related as well to distributive justice, but also to quite some extent to procedural justices. How can people influence decision making on green spaces? And also the question, how does the social political context enable or disable green space use by certain groups? And this is actually where I come in today with my presentation, which sums up one of the chapters of the books. And I will now start sharing with you the presentation. Just bear with me for a second. Yeah, so the question that I would like to focus on today is issues of governance surrounding green spaces, and in particular, with particular focus on neoliberal urban governance and how it is negotiated in different urban gardening projects in the post-socialist city. This project has started actually with a collaboration from the side of Tallinn University with Lilian Pungas from the University of Vienna, where we kind of put together both of our researches. Lilian is focusing on dacha garden cooperatives in Estonia in her research, and we are focusing on community gardens in Estonia, especially in Tallinn. And what we've noticed when we started discussing our research projects is that even though both of these gardening types, we could argue, equally contribute to urban and peri-urban sustainability, which kind of functions as this major narrative in planning at the moment, they are treated in very different ways. While dacha gardens have kind of lived a more marginal existence so far, sometimes even at the risk of their demolition, community gardens, especially in Tallinn, have been seeing a hype during the last years with substantial support from the government, and also kind of in public discourse, to say so. And we started out from this question: what would explain this different treatment if, in terms of sustainability, both of them equally contribute, or maybe dacha gardens, due to the sheer size, maybe even more? So, looking for explanations, we of course also stumbled across studies that would explain it from the perspective of discursive othering, for example, where dacha gardens are seen kind of as a remnant of post-socialist history that people would like to leave behind them. Some also explain it with anti-Soviet or anti-Russian sentiments relating to the history of dacha gardens from the socialist area. However, we were feeling that this does not give the full picture. In fact, our understanding of gardens is that they are always a kind of a product of the socio-political context in which they are embedded. And we would argue that one of the central dynamics that influences actually the way that gardens can the garden projects can evolve, and the way that they are treating is a neoliberal urban governance, which is also kind of a major trend since the beginning of the post-socialist transformation period. And what I would like to do today is to kind of walk you through our thought process and our analysis process, and I'm curious to also hear the discussion afterwards, because it's the first time that we are introducing it to such a big audience. Therefore, I will first tackle the main three concepts that we are using or referring to: post-socialism, neoliberalization, and of course the urban gardening itself, and then go on to the analysis that we have conducted. So when we speak of post-socialism or post-socialist city, I would like to just for the presentation today draw out a few important facts. In a way, we see it as, and not only we, but also others, as already deeply embedded into a neoliberalization process, especially in Estonia, which has come to be known as the kind of prime example of a very rapid and a very rigorous neoliberalization process after Estonia has regained its independence in 1991. Actually has also seen a lot of success, especially in the kind of macroeconomic factors, GDP and so on, and has brought Estonia the reputation of the Baltic tiger. However, it has to be acknowledged that this success story in a way came at a price. A price in terms of social consequences, of a division, to say so, in kind of winners and losers of the transformation, where the latter group are often referred to, or often said to consist of mainly pensioners, people who have lost their employment during the transformation period, and also at large the Russian minority in Estonia due to difficult citizenship issues, especially in the 1990s. This separation between kind of winners and losers of transformation is also what is a little bit at the grounding of the studies that explain the maltreatment of dacha gardens with discourse of othering, for example, because this would then be the group that is perceived to be the losers of transformation. However, where we would come is that we argue that it also has had spatial ramifications, especially in terms of the rapid privatization, which also concerned land ownership at a time where the access to land ownership was unequal, meaning that especially for those whom the citizenship issues were not resolved at this point in time, there was no equal access to land ownership, which results in a situation where we have this kind of unequal dependence of public space between Estonian majority and Russian minority. At the same time, while also public space has been decreasing due to the privatization. In Tallinn, we have now roughly 37% of municipal land, which is to a large extent actually occupied by road infrastructure, social infrastructure, and so on. Last but not least, post-socialist transformation has also resulted in an erosion of alternatives, as it was kind of a complete and intentional break with the Soviet and socialist past. This left turn towards capitalism and towards its neoliberal form in a way unquestioned, or at least to say publicly unquestioned, which might have feeded the process of neoliberalization even more. This has also impeded urban governance, and here we would like to draw out three main dynamics that are also important if we are looking at urban gardens. The first one would be kind of focus on entrepreneurialism and creative competition, which especially in terms of land users means that there is a privileging of a spatial exchange value over the use value of spaces. Hence, there's a privileging on land users that are profitable, which is problematic for gardens per se, as they tend to be high on use value, but low on this profitable exchange value. The next dynamic is the dynamic of privatization that I've already outlined before. That kind of limits public space, or resulted in a loss of public space, and also in a continuation a little bit in a way of modernist city planning, led to a certain level of control over public space on the way that it's supposed to look like, for example, that it's supposed to ensure safety of the citizens and so on. I will get back to that later. And the loss of space is especially relevant here in terms of where to make space for the gardens at the first place, if they are not already existing. the final dynamics would be then the devolution of regulatory responsibilities, which relates to the retrenchment of the state and the neoliberalization processes, kind of encouraging self-help over state help. And here also historically, not only in the post-socialist context, but historically also in gardening projects, they have tended to fill in kind of buffer function in terms of state retrenchment and state crisis. And so this is also a pretty relevant dynamic here for urban gardens. When trying to then see how these dynamics kind of play out in the gardens, we have broken them down into three analytical levels, having a look at the social spatial discourses, the discursive level, meaning in what way do the different gardening projects and the gardeners then relate to hegemonic neoliberal discourses. For example, the discourse of sustainability, which has actually in general started off as a kind of more radical discourse, a more anti-capitalist discourse, and it has by now been largely embedded into the capitalist project. So how do both of the projects relate to such hegemonic discourses? The second question was then concerning spatial materialities. We have the privileging of exchange value of land use over the use value, where gardens would kind of be on the wrong side of it. How do they relate to that? What kind of options does it leave for them, especially in a time where there is a lack or a loss of public space? Also concerning here once again the issue of spatial control and aesthetical norms. And last but not least, neoliberalization also impacts the subjectivities of people. It also does something to people who have to relate to it in a way. And here we were having a look to what extent or what kind of subjectivities are cultivated in both of the gardening types, in the dacha gardens and in the community gardens. And if we can kind of categorize the cultivated subjectivities into more pro-neoliberal subjectivities, which would refer, for example, to entrepreneurial, consumer, and volunteer subjectivities. Volunteer subjectivities mainly regarding to the retrenchment of the state and the kind of offering self-help mechanisms in the gardens. Or if we can find in these projects more gardening forms, more counter-neoliberal subjectivities relating to citizen, producer, and activist subjectivities that would more kind of question the status quo and try to offer alternatives or live like alternatives. So we use this as an analytical frame to then try to bring together both of the researches that we had already done and look at them through the lens of neoliberal urban governance and how it is negotiated in the gardens. We had talked to that was too early, but I will say it already now. We had talked to urban gardeners, to garden users, to politicians and civil servants. Let me just show you here. Over the period of 2 to 3 years, Lilian's research is still also continuing. Lilian has done it all over in dacha communities all over Estonia, and we have been focusing on community gardens and mainly in Tallinn, but to some extent also in Tartu. The way that we have defined urban gardenings, we started out from a very broad understanding of urban gardening as all kind of gardening practices that are located in peri-urban spaces. What was more relevant actually for us was the kind of analytical lens in which we used to study them, with a kind of understanding of urban gardens as a spatial ramification of the social political processes that they are embedded in, meaning that we understand them as being in a way the product, but also embedded in negotiating neoliberal processes. Thereby follow especially Baron, who was a huge inspiration for us, but also Tanagi and Satoma, who have urged to kind of also include the politics of gardening when studying gardening. And the main question or puzzle that we were starting from, as I said already before, was the unequal treatment of dacha and community gardens, and trying to explain it or adding kind of a puzzle piece that would to the explanation that would go beyond anti-Soviet or anti-Russian sentiments, which for sure can also play a role. Dacha gardens that have been then mainly studied by Lilian Pungas were defined in our studies as relatively small plots of lands, often with a seasonal allotment house, mostly used for food production and organized in cooperatives. These are basically allotments which came to be which came a lot to the fore during the socialist periods, especially in the 1970s and 80s in Estonia, to ensure food supply in a time of a shortage economy. However, allotment gardens, as you all know, are not only a socialist phenomenon. You find them also in other spatial and temporal contexts. By now, dacha garden projects have different fates. Some of them became privatized and are slowly developing into residential urban districts, suburban districts, while others are leased or without legal status, and especially those without the legal status, and at a kind of risk of demolition that in some cases has also materialized. Community gardens actually have a much shorter time horizon when we try to look at them. They are defined by a focus on community building and the location on shared semi-public gardening spaces. The first small scale community gardening experiments up to our knowledge were in 2007-2008, and then culminated in a showcase garden project 10 years later. Which was followed by the initiation of what is by now has come to be known as the best practice example, the Lakna Garden in the mainly Russian-speaking Panel district of Lasnamäe in Tallinn. And this has formed in a way as a blueprint, as a best practice blueprint of community gardening in Tallinn, which has then been upscaled with the help of the environmental department all over the last years up until now, 21 community gardening communities all over Tallinn. So what would then, how do both of these projects or forms of gardening then relate to the neoliberalization processes that they are embedded in and surrounded by? When we start with the discourses on the discursive level, then next to the kind of overall, let's say, background discourse, how to explain it, of sustainability as a kind of also a major trend in planning, as Helen has also explained before. That both gardens are in a way also facing, or it's a kind of labels that are projected on them or not. Next to this underneath discourse, we also have really specific framings of greenery and gardening that we found in public discourse. The first one referring to greenery as a garnish, in a way, is something extra, and that can be seen as something extra in terms of land uses. If the focus is on land uses that are profitable, then gardening would be something that is done after we have exhausted profitable land uses on the space that is then still left. But you can also see it in terms of the post-socialist transformation as a garnish, as something extra that we deal with after we have solved real problems in terms of which would mostly be on the economic or social sphere of society. The other framing is more specific to gardening, whereas gardens are seen as a survival, or gardening is seen as a survival practice of the socialist past. at least to some extent. And when there was a food shortage, which need to be kind of dealt with, and that would thereby, in a way, at least urban gardening would thereby, in a way, become obsolete, as we have now consumerist alternatives for ensuring food supplies. How then do both of these gardening types relate to these hegemonic frames and discourses? Our studies showed that community gardens actually put a lot of effort into proving the substantial relevance of gardening for the sustainable city, hence kind of trying also to use the sustainability label to their own advantage, arguing that gardens are enhancing ecological sustainability, they are helping to combat climate change or to adapt to it, they can improve community building, individual health and well-being, and so on. So they really have been trying, have been putting a lot of effort into showing substantial benefits and to working against this understanding of gardening as something extra. Moreover, were also attempts to kind of shake off potential socialist connotations of urban gardening as a survival practice by arguing or portraying, especially community gardening, repeatedly as a Western and Northern European practice that would now also materialize in Estonia. In the Dutch garden communities, however, we found more of a kind of ignoring to a rejection of these hegemonic frames by pointing out the long-standing history of homegrown food in Estonia that continues until today, especially on the countryside and the summer houses and so on, by kind of explaining the way that they grow food, or the natural way that they grow food, as something that is kind of it's something that is a matter of course, in a way, that's how it always has been. But also actively really rejecting the sustainability label as something that is put upon them. And we have a really vivid quote here from a public official who summed up the discussions about Dutchess with regard to the general sustainability discourse. And he said that, now I'm quoting, they called everything sustainable. Sustainable this, sustainable that. I was like, come on, guys, this is not something sustainable. It's just like good construction practice or common sense, with my words. It doesn't have to be special. It's just fucking normal. It's not like, you know, suddenly invented sustainability. People have been building like this for 1,000 years. So it's really like this active rejection of such kind of labeling, and of this kind of maybe also hijacking of practices that have been there for a long time. In terms of materialities then, coming back to the privileging of exchange value over use value of space, but also to the continuation of modernist city planning that is defined by, to some extent, by spatial control, especially for purposes of public health, public hygiene, safety, but also in terms of, let's say, so legitimate landscape aesthetics that would be agreeable, aesthetics that would be in a way also standardized, and as we would argue, aesthetics that are also nicely visualizable, for example, for place promotion purposes, which is definitely an issue in the community gardens. So both of the gardens, in a way, have to relate to these spatial processes around them. And here we found that they are experiencing, in a way, a link between the value of land in which they are situated on and the public gaze in which they find themselves, on the one hand, and on spatial control that they are subjected to on the other hand. So Dutch gardens, they are quite often located in this more low exchange value spaces in the urban periphery or on wastelands, and to some extent out of public gaze, and therefore they have been subjected to less spatial and aesthetical control over the years. This also has its downsides, as this lack of public gaze also has resulted in situations where we have for long years unresolved infrastructural issues, for example, road infrastructure, water pipes, sewage pipes, and so on. However, when they come into public gaze, as was the case, for example, with Sodavahe Dacia community next to Tallinn airport, then their perceived lack of aesthetics is becoming a problem for them. In the Sodavahe case, there were, of course, a lot of other reasons why it in the end became demolished. But in the discussion around this case, there was repeatedly this image of Sodavahe as this kind of disgrace to Estonia, which where we could argue that the perceived lack of aesthetics at least did not help the Dacia garden community in its struggles. The community gardens, on the other hand, they are often located quite much more in public gaze. As I said, the situation in Tallinn is that they usually that we have very few municipal land, and it's usually occupied with social infrastructure. So quite often they are allocated in adjunction to social infrastructures such as youth clubs, libraries, and so on, which are much more visible. And some of them are also located on or next to higher exchange value space, very few. So due to this location, then they have experienced a much higher degree of spatial control and what is said as a legitimate landscape aesthetics. Good example here is the Showcase Gardening project, which was located at the Old Town Belt of Tallinn, where it became an issue that for the building of a greenhouse, recycled and reused materials were used. And it also became an issue what kind of plants are suitable for the city center. Really, in fact, can we grow cabbage in the old town? Is that acceptable or isn't it? Learning from this experience, also the following community gardening projects, next to being subjective, they have also kind of lived a kind of self-subjection, really trying to accommodate, making the places beautiful to the public gaze and trying to accommodate for the spatial control that is expected from them. However, next to this kind of in a way self-subjection, they have also been trying to broaden what is seen as legitimate gardening aesthetics by, for example, reframing gardening, the use of materials that they have as a kind of do-it-yourself, recycling, zero-emission, sustainable construction materials. You really try to use, once again, the sustainability discourse for their own purposes. Last but not least, then the issue of the cultivated subjectivities. So, as I said, we were having a look at what kind of subjectivities are cultivated in both of the gardening types, and if we can categorize them as more pro or more counter neoliberal. Of course, when coming, to the ground, talking to the real people, then things become messy. So, of course, we found a lot more hybrid and ambivalent pictures when being in the communities, where we have a lot of simultaneous pro and counter neoliberal subjectivities in both gardening types. However, we still would argue that we could identify trends, and the trend would be that there's a tendency in community gardens to be more actively engaged with neoliberal discourses and practices, and thereby allowing them to thrive. For example, with really going along with the expectations on spatial control and accepted aesthetics, or on the case for some community gardens, for sure, is to really also engage in place promotion and really promoting marketing, promoting also the whole district and the whole city. Dacia gardens, on the other hand, have more been kind of quietly maintaining the neoliberal systems. Hence, they are not actively engaged, but by offering buffering mechanisms, especially in terms of entrepreneurial subjectivities of people selling their produce, for example, on the street to gain some extra income. They have, thereby in a way quietly maintained also the neoliberalization that has been going on. So this active engagement with the system of neoliberal urban governance, in a way, we would say, resulted in tangible support for the community gardens. As you see, we had a huge development from one or two, or from a few, to say, in 2018 up to 21 today. But as you will see when I discuss a little bit as the last point in more detail, the subjectivities, that it has also made them much more vulnerable to co-optation attempts in comparison to Dutch gardens. So I will not go through all of the subjectivities. I would just like to draw out main tendencies. So in terms of the Dutch gardens, then what I would see as important to discuss here is maybe the higher prevalence of a producer subjectivity in really producing foods in the garden over in community gardens having maybe mainly gardening as a practice, because already the lack of space in the community gardens doesn't really allow to have enough, to grow enough food for for own uses or for selling them. And related to producer subjectivity is also entrepreneurialist subjectivity in the Dutch gardens, which is not a profit-oriented one, but more a self-reliant, proactive and creative way of coping and with meager incomes. We also find citizen and activist subjectivities in the gardens. However, they are not specifically announced, labeled as such, but kind of living activism in everyday life by really creating alternative food supply chains, for example, next to consumerist opportunities. For the community gardens, they also started off mainly from citizen and activist subjectivities, strong focus on food urbanism and urban activism. For example, the Lagna Garden project was part of spatial experiments in Lasnamäe districts, which were related to urban activism in Tallinn. But through the involvement of the project, they have gradually transformed and also been intention to more pro-neoliberal subjectivities. For example, a shift from food urbanism to food education, of really like educating city children where the carrot comes from. Urban activism has been in tension with the expectations of project management on the community garden leaders to really be able to work in project cycles, to function as the communication link between the city and its citizens, and so on. The same kind of tensions we can also find in terms of this is where I would like to stop then, in terms of volunteering subjectivities, where the community gardens really started off with a strong identification as activists and volunteering, offering a lot also to do by themselves, which in the end resulted in a situation where a lot of them became really overburdened because of the gradually raising expectations, also in terms of project management, and then taking over other tasks, also maybe social service tasks by the state. So they are constantly now negotiating kind of what are the conditions of volunteering, thereby kind of also reacting to maybe co-optation attempts by the system. So to sum up, we would then say that the preferential treatment of community gardens comes from their active engagement with neoliberal discourse and practices. I'm saying here active engagement, it doesn't mean active support of them. It means just to really engage, to relate to them. But this engagement has come at its, or this preferential treatment has come at the price of a higher vulnerability to co-optation attempts, especially in terms of control of space, to which the Dutch gardens have hitherto quietly resisted. And with this thought and conclusion, I would like to leave you now, and I'm very curious about the discussion later. And I think I'm handing over to Tina and to Bradley now. Thank you very much.